right, well, thank you for the songs again. We'll be going to Isaiah chapter 49. Isaiah chapter 49. In our series through the book of Isaiah, this is now message number 61, entitled The Servant Will Not Fail. And we're going to be looking at the rest of this chapter, so verses 14 to. But Zion said, in me, and my Lord hath forgotten me. Now, chapter 49 begins the second section of part 2 of Isaiah, which covers from chapter 49 through chapter 57. And this particular section of Isaiah focuses on this figure, the servant of Yahweh, one of the messianic titles that Isaiah uses. And this servant of Yahweh is set up for us by the servant Cyrus in the previous section. And so the previous section focused on the exile and return from exile, and particularly Cyrus being used as an instrument to decree the return, to decree the rebuilding of the wall, to even decree and impart finance the laying of the foundation for the second temple. And so he was the servant. He was a servant of the Lord, and he was spoken of in messianic terms. But we also saw how that Cyrus fell very far short of the full messianic picture. And he was a servant that did not succeed in the restoration of Israel, but a partial return. So it's not that it wasn't important. It was, and it was a sign of that greater future return in the new Exodus that is to come. So we're set up to expect, by the time we get to the end, we're set up to expect a greater servant. There's going to have to be more than just this political figure that affects the return, sort of reverses the Babylonian exile, but there's going to have to be more than that. And so we're set up to encounter this servant of Yahweh in this section. And in fact, this section focuses on that servant and has 3 of the 4 of what are called servant songs. We talked a little bit about this. These servant songs are specific pieces of prophecy that have been composed in a more poetic form, dealing specifically with the servant of Yahweh. And so we've already covered 2 of those now, and we had one, the second one at the beginning of chapter 49, verses 1 to 13. There's one more in chapter 50, and the last one in chapters 52 through 53. So chapter 49 begins with the second servant song, and each of those songs has something in particular about the work of the servant of Yahweh that it highlights. And this song in the beginning of chapter 49 highlights the humiliation of the servant, and even what might appear to be failure of the servant. He was rejected. He did not restore Israel. He did not establish the kingdom. All of those things that did not happen with his first coming. Now, his failure, though, is answered as you continue on in the song. It's answered by giving an assurance of his calling, that indeed this is the servant of Yahweh. Yeah, he will appear to fail from a certain point of view. He will appear to fail, but this is the servant of Yahweh. This is the one who has been called. This is the one who has been commissioned. So we get an assurance of his calling. We get an expression of his commission, and we get a vision of his victory. So he has suffered humiliation, but kings will ultimately bow before him in his exaltation. And so we get both of those things in this servant song. And we've talked about it a number of times, and it's worth rehearsing and keeping in mind as we look at these messianic prophecies in Isaiah, how that he so often blends these first and second advents. And there are times he doesn't really indicate a timing. He doesn't really indicate a gap in between them. But there are times, like in this servant song, where he's clearly indicating two different comings. There's a coming in humiliation, and there's a coming in victory. And so he is making a distinction there, but again, not giving us a timeline. So we are reminded in this servant song of what the servant will accomplish through the new covenant. He's going to be given as a covenant, and we learn obviously more about that in other places as well, but it was anticipated in the prophecy of Moses back in Deuteronomy. So through this new covenant, he's going to accomplish the restoration of the land, the possession of inheritances, and a new exodus for Israel to abundant prosperity, peace, and safety in their own land. So this will mean that prophesied gathering of exiled Israel from among the nations of the earth to their promised inheritance. And that begins all the way back with Abraham in Genesis chapter number 12. And then this servant song ends with this call to sing the new song. When the heavens and the earth and the mountains are said, we'll sing praise to Yahweh because he has comforted his nation. Now, obviously, we shouldn't be surprised in reading the servant song. We shouldn't be surprised with the heavy focus on Israel. But the song also reveals to us that the commission of the servant, it is larger than that. His calling is larger than that. He is the Redeemer of Israel, yes. But a song also reveals that God's purpose is larger to include all the nations of the earth. And so the rest of the chapter includes, that was really what we called the first movement of this chapter, and it certainly flows in a sequence. And the next two movements are in the rest of this chapter. And we get another apparent failure. And that apparent failure comes in the form of the reality of the exile to those of Zion to give their complaints. In other words, this long exile leads to this sort of complaint that Israel felt abandoned and forsaken. In other words, that they were in a miserable state that's just going to continue in perpetuity, and there's no escape from it. Well, God answers this complaint, and he answers this complaint as saying that he will indeed restore the nation, and his enemies will be destroyed. And so that's the next two movements in this chapter. So we're going to look at it. And we'll take each in turn. Verses 14 to 21, that gives us Zion's complaint and the Lord's response. And verses 22 to 26, which speaks of the accomplishment of the mission of the servant of Yahweh when nations are saved and nations are destroyed. So we'll start here in the first part with Zion's complaints. Let's look again at verse number 14. But Zion said, the Lord hath forsaken me, and my Lord hath forgotten me. So this is a complaint that is spoken against all of the prophecy, all of the word that has been delivered, all the promises, all the assurances, all of those things that have happened. But those of Zion, those of Israel, have complained and said, "But we're forsaken, being scattered among all the nations to the extents of the earth. We are abandoned. We have no help, and deliverance it would seem not to be coming." And so this image is introduced here in verse 15. Can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should not have compassion on the son of her womb? Yea, they may forget, yet will I not forget thee. So this is the imagery again, that is imagery of God as a mother and referring to those mothering instincts. And so the question, can a woman forget her little child, even a nursing infant that is indicated here? And obviously there's a contrast here, and even the verse admits, yea, she might forget. As unthinkable of a thing as that is, it does happen, and it can happen. Now, for many, it's really a just a beautiful thing to see that with so many women with children, it seems like they just immediately, they just have a mothering instinct that immediately just kicks in. And it's not that necessarily really that they've been trained to do that or any, but it just kicks in. And there's the bond between that mother and a child, especially as that little baby and the nursing infants and all of those sort of things. And so it is a question that would cause us to pause. That's unthinkable, but it does happen. But nevertheless, God says He will never forget His people, His nation of Israel. Now, what we're leading into here in this, let's look at verses 16 and 17. Behold, I have graven thee upon the palms of my hands. Thy walls are continually before me. Thy children shall make haste. Thy destroyers and they that made thee waste shall go forth of thee. What we are leading into with reference to thy children and such is this imagery that evolves as Israel as a bereft widow. And it is further developed in Isaiah. It's introduced here. But we're actually prepared for this in the previous section, chapter 47, verses 8 and 9. In that chapter about the destruction of Babylon, we had this word that Babylon thought of itself as a woman that would never be widowed and as a woman that would never be childless. And however, that is exactly what would come upon them. And so we're getting something of a contrast because Babylon never thought they'd be that. And then we're getting an introduction here through this imagery to Israel as this bereft widow. That is actually the condition of Israel. And actually this imagery began very early, chapter 1, verse 21, when he pictured, the prophet pictured Israel as an unfaithful wife. And that shows up a number of times in the prophets. And of course, the story of the unfaithful wife is usually one that ends in misery and loneliness. And that's where Israel thought themselves to be. But notice that God is speaking into that with this imagery that, again, we've talked about how we saw earlier that imagery of God as a mother, but it extends far beyond, not just to nursing infants, but even to your old age and even to death and so on that God carries. So what we get is that God has marked them, a mark of permanence upon His hands. This is reassuring language that God cannot forget His nation of Israel. Not just that He will not, but that He cannot. In other words, we've talked about also at times when God speaks about how that He does things toward Israel for His own sake or for the sake of His own name. And he has bound Himself with this nation. He has bound Himself to this nation. And so He cannot forget them. And of course, the language of remembering and of forgetting obviously has covenantal implications. But God cannot forget this nation. Verse 17, thy children shall make haste, thy destroyers, and they that made thee waste shall go forth of thee. And these sons that they're spoken of, the children, the sons, they shall return. In other words, this is a hint of a return. So they are in exile, thinking that they've been forsaken, they've been forgotten, they've been abandoned. But they're the children, and again the bereft widow that is has lost her family. They shall return, and the destroyers shall leave. In other words, there will be a switch that will take place. And Israel will possess her possession without hindrance. Now, as we continue in this part, verse 18, lift up thine eyes round about, and behold, all these gather themselves together and come to thee. As I live, saith the Lord, thou shalt surely clothe thee with them all, as with an ornament, and bind them on thee as a bride doth. So this is spoken of in terms of when these children begin returning. And so this is a part of the greatness of the imagery of Israel as a bereft widow when children start returning. and they're like adornment. You will be adorned. You're going to be decked out. In other words, with all of these that are returned. And so these children will be, again, like these ornaments. Verse 19, for thy waste and thy desolate places in the land of thy destruction shall even now be too narrow by reason of the inhabitants, and they that swallowed thee up, which shall be far away. Now, this is a reference, again, to the land of Israel. And so in this time, when they come into full possession, which they've never had full possession of this land promised beginning with Abraham, but when they come into full possession of this land, and the children began to return. Remember, they've been scattered among all the nations to the furthest extents of the earth. And when they're gathered in from afar and they begin to return, it's going to be like that they begin to question, is this land going to be big enough? Is this land going to be big enough? This return will be so great. Will this land be big enough? Verse 20, the children which thou shalt have after thou hast lost the other shall say again in thine ears, the place is too strait for me. Give place to me that I may dwell. So in their restoration, they will be fruitful and they will bring forth a numerous nation. And we probably don't think about that quite as much as we should. But Isaiah tells us this clearly. Other places in the Bible tells us clearly there will be an intervening age. There will be, after the day of the Lord, there will be those descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that will enter into this kingdom in their mortal bodies. And they are going to experience life in this kingdom and in their land, in their mortal bodies. And so children will be born. The earth, the population will be recovered of the earth during that time. And again, the time that we're told in Revelation 20 lasts for 1,000 years. And he's saying that this nation is going to become very vast, very numerous during this particular time, such that it's almost as if they think that, well, the land was going to be too crowded, not able to contain all of the nation. Verse 21, then shalt thou say in thine heart, who hath begotten me these, seeing I have lost my children, and am desolate, a captive, and removing to and fro? And who hath brought up these? Behold, I was left alone. These, where had they been? So this is a continuing, again, of this imagery. Israel as the bereft widow, having lost her children, essentially being alone and forsaken and abandoned, having none to care to provide for her. And then seeing in this restoration what was unthinkable in the exile. So the blessings that come in the restoration are such that they swallow up the sufferings of the exile. And so these questions are really a marveling at what has been done. Where did they all come from? How is this possible? How have I so long been alone, and now I'm surrounded by children. Now I'm surrounded by family. And then so that's the answer to Zion's complaint, this reassurance. And then beginning with verse 22 to the end of this chapter, we get that completion of the mission of the servant of Yahweh that results in nations saved and nations destroyed. Verse number 22. Thus saith the Lord God, behold, I will lift up my hand to the Gentiles and set up my standard to the people, and they shall bring thy sons in their arms, and thy daughters shall be carried upon their shoulders. Now, we've had this sort of language and imagery before in Isaiah, the lifting up of the hand, the raising up of a flag or a banner or some sort of an ensign. In other words, it's a call. It's a call. It's a call or a signal to the nations. And no more will those nations retain Israel, but will bring them to the land. And so we get use of both words for nations, actually. people there is plural amim. Gentiles is actually goyim. Is a word for nations. And notice as you read this section, and we're talking about, think about where we're at when this is taking place. All right, we're not something that's already happened or something that's happening today. We are something that's happening in the future to us. We don't know how far in the future, but it's in the future to us. They are returning from all the nations where they have been scattered. And these nations are essentially returning them to this land. And what you'll notice as we read about this is that distinctions are constantly maintained, else the language wouldn't really even have any meaning. The nations, and translated here Gentiles, but again, that word don't mean Gentiles. That word means nations. Gentiles is just what has just come through usage. The nations are the ones being signaled to. And notice it says, they shall bring thy or your sons in their arms, and thy or your daughters shall be carried upon their shoulders. In other words, this distinction is maintained in the new Exodus. There are nations, there are peoples, and there is Israel. And there is Israel's sons and Israel's daughters that have been scattered among all of these other nations that are non-Israel nations, all over the earth, all extending of the earth. And again, this is a time of their restoration. Well, what I'm saying is that this distinction is maintained. It's held. In fact, it continues. You look at the end of Revelation and you see nations continuing, bringing their glory into Jerusalem and in the New Jerusalem and the new creation. This is distinguished. So there's never a point where the Bible anywhere collapses all the saved into one homogeneous mass of humanity. Never does that. Now, again, sometimes we get used to land. We see Gentiles, and one of the problems with Gentiles is that we usually think of people individually as Gentile. Well, that's not a Jew, but really it's nations, and it's non-Jewish nations oftentimes, as is the case here. But these distinctions are being maintained. So when this restoration that's prophesied is fulfilled, it will involve Israel, descended from Jacob, and the nations of the earth. And again, those are never collapsed into one. Verse 23, and kings shall be thy nursing fathers, and their queens thy nursing mothers. They shall bow down to thee with their face toward the earth, and lick up the dust of thy feet. And thou shalt know that I am the Lord, for they shall not be ashamed that wait for me. So what this is pointing to is that in that day, in that time, Israel will be exalted. Now, we've seen this referenced in Isaiah, starting, I think, back in chapter 2, and we've seen it several times as we've come along, and obviously there's other prophecies about how that they're, and Moses even prophesied about these things as well. Israel's going to be exalted. There's going to come a time when this exile is going to be reversed, and there will be a new Exodus. And they will no longer be the offscouring, no longer be the parable, the byword, no longer be the tail and not the head. They will be exalted, and all nations will come to them. Now, this image is not something that we're very used to, but bowing down with their face toward the earth and looking up. This is an expression essentially referring to bowing and kissing the feet. And what the imagery is about is that it's a sign of submission. It's a sign of subjection as to a king. And so Israel will be that ruling nation in that kingdom. And not only that, when this comes about, he says, you will know that I am the Lord. You will know that. You will know that you are not forsaken, you are not forgotten. You will know that you are redeemed and that the Lord has done it. So they that wait will not be ashamed. Now, we've encountered this a number of times as well. This idea of being ashamed means having your hopes frustrated, finding that thing that you trusted in was not able to save, was not able to deliver you. It's why those that trust in idols will be ashamed. They will be confounded because those things will not be able to deliver them. So God says, all those that wait, obviously wait, those that have faith, those that believe, and those that wait will not be ashamed, no matter how long that wait may be. Verse 24. Shall the prey be taken from the mighty, or the lawful captive delivered? Now, obviously, this is another question that introduces some imagery. So if you have some mighty predator that has captured its prey, is that predator just going to give up that prey? Is that prey just going to be lightly taken away from the predator? And the answer, of course, is no. And the expected answer is, well, will the lawful captive be delivered? A lawful captive, he says, be delivered. So one that has been taken, most likely through a loss, through being conquered. Are they just going to be handed over? And of course, the expected answer to that is no. Well, of course, the prey and the captive, in this case, would refer to Israel, and how they have been oppressed by the nations of the earth, and so on. And will they be given up? All right, well, here's the thing, verse 25. But thus saith the Lord, even the captives of the mighty shall be taken away, and the prey of the terrible shall be delivered. For I will contend with him that contendeth with thee, and I will save thy children. So in the normal course of events, if a mighty nation has taken another nation captive, well, will those captives just be taken away? Not likely. Same way with a strong predator, large predator that has taken a prey. Will it be taken away? Again, not likely. However, it can happen if a stronger nation or power comes against that mighty nation that holds captives. A stronger power may come against them and take them away. A larger, stronger predator may come away and take the prey. And so this, of course, this ties in to when Jesus was talking in Matthew chapter 12, verses 25 to 29, about the binding of Satan, how that the spoiling of the strong man will be, or how the strong man will be bound and the house spoiled, and so on. And that's exactly what we see taking place when we look at Revelation chapter number 20. And really, this brings us back to the Abrahamic covenant. He says, I will contend with him that contendeth with thee, and I will save thy children. In other words, no nation, group of nations is going to be able to stand against the Lord and prevent his gathering of his nation. Verse 26. And I will feed them that oppress thee with their own flesh, and they shall be drunken with their own blood, as with sweet wine. And all flesh shall know that I, the Lord, am thy Savior and thy Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob. Now, this is a reference to, it's a very vivid, very gory sort of reference, but it is a reference to the judgments of the tribulation. And those judgments will come upon all the nations of the earth. Sometimes it's put as all of those that have that oppose and afflict his nation of Israel. And it's going to be done in such a way that all will know that the Lord did it, that the Lord is responsible for these judgments. And we saw how that worked in Egypt in the book of Exodus. We also read of very similar descriptions that occur during that time of tribulation in the book of Revelation, is these things will be done in such a way that all will know. In other words, this just won't just be a normal war, a normal course of events, but these are going to be supernatural interventions bringing these judgments. And notice how that this reference to all flesh shall know is actually what's sometimes referred to as an enveloping structure, but it actually returns to the very beginning of the chapter, because at the beginning of the chapter, the servant called for all the nations to listen and to give attention. And by the end of the chapter, he says, all will know that I have done it in regard to his gathering and restoring of his nation. Of course, using these terms, Savior, Redeemer, and Mighty One. Redeemer, again, the word for kinsman redeemer. The Mighty One of Jacob being the strength of Jacob or Israel. Now, some people reject the literal nature of the judgments at the end of the age, when the whole world undergoes this tribulation that has never occurred before and will never occur after. Some people reject it. They say, well, this is just the course of history playing out, and there are times of protracted suffering and disasters and events and things that take place. And there's similarly some people that reject a literal hell punishment and have various means of doing so. And it just seems like I've noticed that at some point along the way, if you get to the root of why, it's because it's just too terrible to imagine. It's just too terrible to imagine. So people find a way of explaining away the reality of hell, the reality of these judgments. It's just too terrible to imagine. Well, it is true that these judgments, they are terrible, and they're terrible beyond our comprehension of terrible. But that is because of the terrible depths of sin. And that usually is what is missing in that equation. We have, hell, the severity of hell as it's described in the Bible, that has to be figurative, that has to be spiritualized. The reality of these judgments, that's too terrible. And again, it's overlooking the truly terrible depths of sin. And how do we balance those things out? I mean, I don't really know of anyone that enjoys thinking about the terrors of hell or the terrors of judgment that is to come. But we balance that out by looking at the terrible depths of sin that caused Jesus to go to the cross, to suffer all of the things that he suffered. And we have to be very careful that we don't just look at a moment of time and judge God as being too harsh. And so Israel, looking at their circumstances in long exiles, well, we're forgotten, we're forsaken, we're abandoned. And oftentimes in times of intense suffering and even really deep disappointment, we can feel that way. We can feel like that we've been abandoned, that we've been forgotten, we've been forsaken. But we also need to think about, as we read this, again, these events that are being described, some of the events in this chapter, things have already taken place. Some of them have not yet taken place. That means they're a future to us. And while this is primarily a word that is given to Israel, and particularly given to Judah, but it's also a word to Israel as a whole, and it's also a word to those nations that are being addressed. And we see here, some of those nations are saved, and they come and worship in Jerusalem in the kingdom. And some of those are destroyed because they're unbelieving. Well, the point is that this really is a word that is comforting to all of us, as well as it is to Israel, as well as it is to Judah. It's also a warning that speaks to the unbelieving, and it's an assurance that speaks to the faithful. So again, we don't ever want to look at our immediate circumstances, whatever they might be, or some immediate circumstance in the world, and then begin to judge God, then begin to judge God's actions, then to begin to judge whether or not God is being faithful to his word. All right, that's all of our message. We will close with a hymn.